I'm here today with my friend Bela Dekany. Bela's a highly accomplished violinist. For decades, he was the lead musician, or in American English, we call it the concert master, of the BBC Symphony Orchestra in London. And Bela's also played with many other orchestras. One of the most famous concerts he led on many occasions, which is well known even to those of you who don't follow classical music, is the annual Last Night of the Proms at London's Royal Albert Hall, the much loved concert that is very much a highlight of Britain's cultural calendar. But Bela was not born in Britain. He was born in Budapest in Hungary to a Jewish family and is a teenage Holocaust survivor. He was deported to and survived a slave labor camp in Austria. Then he survived the horrific Bergen-Belsen death camp in Germany. And then at the end of the war, as the British Army were about to liberate Belsen, some of the surviving prisoners, including Bela, who was then aged 16, and his mother, were sent to Theresienstadt, north of Prague, which was the last of the concentration camps to be liberated on May 8th, 1945. But Bela's mother tragically died the following morning after liberation of starvation. She weighed almost nothing. Because Bela is almost 93 and his wife passed away 3 years ago, he's been in isolation due to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic since the beginning of March and has not gone outside his home since then. We are now in October, and it's difficult for him to use Zoom, so we are recording this conversation as an audio instead. So, good morning, Bela.
Good morning, Tom. It's good to talk to you.
It's good. Are you doing okay? Good to talk to you too.
I am fine, thank you very much. I cope well with the isolation, and so I'm not complaining.
Good. Yes, Bela, one of the last times you probably went out was when we met for dinner in the middle of February, a couple of weeks before the pandemic really got going in Britain, at the home of your close friend and eminent musician, eminent fellow musician, Murray Pariah, and his lovely wife, Ninette. So I do hope that the pandemic will be over sooner than we think, and we'll be able to meet again not before too long.
That would be very nice, Tom.
Yes.
Indeed.
Yes. So Bela, let's start a little bit at the beginning. You were born, as I mentioned, in Hungary at the very end of April 1928. Tell me a little bit about your childhood, your parents, and so on.
Well, Tom, sadly, I lost my father when I was 1 year old. He died in 1929, aged only 46. So I didn't know him, obviously. But according to my relatives, who told me later, my father was a very fine, gentle and caring human being. It was a terrible loss to my dear mother, obviously, who was left with two young children, my brother, who was 2 years older than me, and of course myself.
And you I remember you telling me that your mother moved back to the town, another town in Hungary where she was from Budapest, to join other relatives there. Is that right?
Yes, indeed, that's correct, Tom. My mother decided in 1931, when I was 3 years old, that she wanted to go back to a place called Karszag, about 100 miles east of Budapest, in the middle of the Hungarian plain. But her mother was still alive, my grandmother, and also two of her sisters were living there. So we moved back to Karszag in 1931.
And if I remember, there's some eminent connections there. A couple of them. The headmaster of the school, you've told me in the past, had been your grandfather for 42 years, whose name was David Raab, R-A-A-B. And I think you mentioned that David Raab, your grandfather, is from the same part of Hungary that's now in the south of Slovakia, where the family of the current British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab's father, was from. And of course, Dominic Raab's father, Peter Raab, escaped just before the war, eventually to Britain, and his son, born after the war, is now Foreign Secretary. So I believe you may even be related to Dominic Raab through your grandfather, Peter Raab.
Yes, and I have a feeling that he might be a distant relation.
Yes.
My grandfather, David Raab, and the name Raab is not that very common. So I just have a feeling that he might be a distant relation.
Could be.
But I never met him, and of course I don't intend to pursue.
Yes, yes. And there's another, you mentioned that after your grandfather, David Raab, had been the headmaster of the elementary school, when you were at the elementary school, which I think you went to from the age of 6 to 10, the headmaster then was another person who came from an eminent family, Moshe Hershko.
Indeed. Moshe Hershko was a very important influence to me and to all the young Jewish children. He was a very special human being. The sort of person whose face radiates wisdom, goodness, and goodwill. He was a wonderful man. And miraculously, he and his wife and 2 young sons at the time survived the Holocaust. And of course, later they emigrated to Israel. And his 2 children became distinguished doctors, both of them. The older one, Chaim, was a well-known distinguished consultant at the Hadassah. He also did some research, I believe. And the younger son, Avram, dedicated himself entirely to research. And in 2004, he was awarded the Nobel Prize. So it's incredibly great honor, obviously.
So yes, so sorry, go on.
Yes.
No, I was just saying, so one of the headmaster's son, who you also knew, Avram Hershko, famously won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 2004. I think he was with the Technion University near Haifa. And I believe I read about him at the time that some of his discoveries even helped save the life of one of his own friends who had cancer. So obviously very distinguished and miraculously, they survived the camp they were sent to in the war as children by the Nazis.
Oh, that's very interesting. I didn't know that actually, but I know he did some very important research. I believe into the blood cells, something to do with the blood cells, and I was told at the time about it, but of course it's way above my comprehension.
Mine too.
Obviously, he must be a very distinguished scientist.
Yes.
The Nobel Prize.
Now.
And I remember how pleased and proud I was at the time. But at the same time, I was sorry that his parents were dead by then, you see. so they couldn't witness that incredible achievement. And
yes, of their son winning
of their son, yes.
Winning the Nobel.
That was, yes, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. Bela, let's just go back a little bit more. We're still before the Holocaust, so you're in elementary school. When did you start playing the violin, and who influenced you? That was before the Holocaust, yes?
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. In fact, one of my mother's sister, the older sister, called Paula, married a man called Dekany, and he was a photographer. They had 3 children. One of them was Andrew, a violinist, a graduate of the Liszt Academy in Budapest. And he was at the time back from Budapest in Karczag. And as a 4 or 5 years old, I listened for hours to his practicing, and I was imitating his movements. So Andrew, or Bundy as we called him, it was his nickname, Bundy, obviously got the message and started teaching me just before my 6th birthday. In fact, I think I could read music before I learned the ABC.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I started.
Yeah. And when we've spoken in the past, because your own father passed away a few months after you were born, this cousin, Dekany, you've mentioned, became almost like a second father to you. And I also believe, just to fill people in, your father's name, the family name, had been Berger. But as you said before, even though it's a German name, in Hungary, that would identify you as a Jew. So therefore, because of the anti-Semitism and so on, you took your cousin's name, Dekany. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Well, Bundy, as we called him, he was a wonderful person. He gave me long lessons every day. And in 4 years, when I was age 10, I was accepted after an entrance exam as a student of the famous Franz Liszt Academy in Budapest. Apart from teaching me correct, he was a kind of second father to me. He gave me lots of love, care, and even when I was studying at the academy in Budapest, he often came up to see how I was progressing until 1942, when he was called up with other Jewish men into the military labor service. All those men were taken to the Russian front and suffered terribly. And I am afraid we never saw my dear cousin again.
Yeah. Just for anyone who doesn't know, some Jewish men were put in what was really the equivalent of a slave labor battalion. It wasn't really part of the army. It was almost destined to die on the Russian front.
They didn't have a uniform. They had to wear their own clothes, and of course they were taken to the Russian front, and the horrible, all the Russian winter,
they're cold and hungry.
Suffered terribly, and of course the officers and the men who were supposed to look after them. Every working brigade had an officer and 2 or 3 rabid anti-Semites, most of them.
Yeah, the Hungarian fascist army was treating them terribly.
Horribly.
Yes.
And they were used to clear the minefields and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And very few of them
Survived.
came back after the war, sadly. And of course, my dear cousin, we don't know
what happened to him.
We saw what happened to him, but we never saw him again.
So, Bela, let's just talk about yourself and your mother and your brother. You were, just to fill people in, the Hungarian fascists were terrible anti-Semites, but they weren't en masse murdering Jews to the extent that happened once the Nazis came in 1944 and started deporting hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. So what happened to yourself?
Well, as you say, in a way, Hungarian Jews were lucky, if that is the right word, because until 1944, apart from this poor man of the military working brigades, the rest of us were living quite comfortably in Hungary. And we didn't know about Auschwitz and the horrible things that happened in Poland and Russia. But by then, as we learned much later, millions of Jews were murdered. For example, the German occupation took place on the 19th of March, 1944. But the day before, I was still going to the music academy for lessons. And so it all happened so suddenly. And within 3 months, almost 500,000 Jews were murdered, most of them in Auschwitz.
Now, in fact, 400,000 or 500,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered, and in a way, when we spoke in the past, I don't know if it's appropriate to use the word lucky, but you said you're one of the quote-unquote lucky ones, that you were, instead of sent to Auschwitz, you were sent to a slave labor camp in Austria, where at least you weren't killed upon arrival like the Jews, the Hungarian Jews, for the most part, sent to Auschwitz.
Yes, that's correct. We were taken, first of all, we had to, all the provincial Jews were all sent to ghettos. And in our case, from the ghetto in Karczag, we were sent to the so-called capital of the district called Szolnok, where there was a collection camp. And there were about 6,000 Jews in a sugar factory. And from there were 2 trains. So about 3,000 each train, and we had no idea where we were going. But by chance, we were lucky enough, we and my family, not just my mother, but auntie and uncles and cousins, were in the train that was going to Austria, not to Auschwitz. Apparently, there were only 20,000 Jews out of roughly 400 in the provinces of Hungary who were not taken to Auschwitz, but to Austria for forced labor. And that's how we escaped. lived at the time.
And
so most of the survivors are those who were lucky enough to go to Austria instead of Auschwitz. Of course, many of them died, like my poor mother, but most of the survivors were among those who were sent to Austria.
I mean, when we've spoken before, you mentioned that most of your fellow students from school were taken to the gas chamber, and I think you've also mentioned your mother was one of 11 children, and they all died, or almost all of them were murdered by the Nazis. Yeah.
Yes.
Or most of them.
Yeah. Many of them.
And cousins and uncles, school friends.
Yes. Well, of course, we were a very close community in Prague, in the provincial city. And, for example, there were only 7 children who were born in 1928. So we were only 7 in my class. Only 1 boy and 5 girls. And of course, the other boy called Robb, unfortunately, was in the other transport. And he must have been killed straight away when they arrived in Auschwitz.
So Bela, you then spent some time in Belsen, which is there were many Nazi concentration camps and death camps. Belsen is definitely one of the worst. I mean, they were all horrific, of course, but one of the worst. That must have been hell when you were there.
It was hell. It was hell. Of course, Belsen had no gas chamber, it's true, but people died from hunger and disease.
Emaciated bodies, quite unbelievable.
Absolutely. People have seen the horrible pictures which were
skeletons. It was when that camp was liberated by the British Army. It was it was shown in British cinemas. It was just shocking to people to even look how human beings had been treated by other human beings, only because they were Jewish, and it was just horrific. And then you went, as I mentioned in the introduction, as the British Army were approaching Belsen, you were transferred with some of the other people from Belsen to Theresienstadt, which is known as Terezin in Czech, which is a little bit north of Prague, and was the last camp to be liberated. And in fact, my grandmother's parents were in Theresienstadt, and also some of my grandfather's family were also there. And one of the things that I've always found disappointing, to say the least, is the reason it was the last camp to be liberated is that General Patton of the American Army deliberately stopped a few days earlier in Pilsen, west of Prague, west of Terezin, under the agreement Roosevelt had made with Stalin to allow the Red Army, to come in to take over Czechoslovakia. So General Patton's forces could have liberated Theresienstadt some days earlier. Instead, the Red Army finally reached the camp. It was the day after VE Day. It was a week after Hitler was dead. It was a week after Berlin and Vienna had already fallen. So had General Patton been allowed by Roosevelt to, or at least by the Americans, by Truman, to liberate Theresienstadt a week earlier, who knows, maybe your mother might have survived.
Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah.
That's very interesting, Tom. I didn't know this.
Yes,
I didn't know
I've written about it. Because I have many relatives that were there too. I've, taken an interest in what happened at the end of the war and why there was a delay in liberating Theresienstadt. Anyway, so after the war, what happened next? Your mother had died the day after liberation, and then what happened?
Well, as I said, my auntie, one of my mother's sister, was also in Theresienstadt with her husband and my cousin, the daughter. And of course we wanted to get back to Hungary. What else could we do? But it wasn't easy to organize, obviously, transport for so many people. So we had to wait till the end of June 45 till they were able to organize a train to get us back to Budapest.
And
so
yeah.
We went back at the end of June to Budapest, and of course by then there was quite a bit of communication between Jewish organizations, and my brother, who survived the Holocaust, the working service, he knew that I'm coming back, and he also knew that we lost our mother. So, but he was at the station.
So he was waiting because he'd been sent. He was 2 years older. He'd been sent to one of these slave labor battalions on the east. He survived.
Yes,
he also made it back to Budapest, and you were reunited in Budapest.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And of course, my brother later made Aliyah to Israel, and he lived in Netanya. Sadly, he passed away when he was 73.
Mm-hmm. So,
because he had to have a bypass operation in his early 50s, and when he was 73, he
passed
died,
away.
unfortunately.
So your brother moved to Israel, but you eventually in 1956 moved to Britain, to London, where you, as I mentioned before, later joined the BBC Symphony Orchestra. What were your first impressions when you arrived in Britain? What were your experiences there?
Lots of things happened before that to me.
Okay.
I left Hungary in 1949 for Vienna for further studies, and which was a very interesting time for me musically. Of course, Vienna is a wonderful place, musically speaking. And I had a wonderful teacher there, Professor Ernst Moravec, who was solo viola of the Vienna Philharmonic, and a very well-known pedagogue. I learned a lot from him, and also the experience of hearing the Vienna Philharmonic, which was a wonderful orchestra, and also the wonderful performances in the opera, particularly of Mozart operas. It was an eye-opener, really, a wonderful experience for me. And after that I went to Switzerland, where my teacher got me a job, and that was my first employment in Winterthur near Zurich. It was a very, very good handpicked orchestra. And from there I went to Australia in 1951. And I stayed there for 5 years and I became a British subject there.
I see.
So it was in 1956 when I came to London, but as a British subject by then. So by then I wasn't a refugee. And I joined the Philharmonia Orchestra, which was a very fine orchestra at the time. And that's where I met my wife, Dorothy, who was a cellist in the orchestra. And from there, I went to Holland, where I formed a string quartet. And I stayed there for about 6 years. And then, by then I was married. And that's where both of my children were born, in Holland. But we came back to London at the end of 1968. And that's when I joined the BBC Symphony Orchestra. And I was leader for some 22 years, I think.
And I mean, I'm not in the world of music, but people I know who are say that, of course, you are a magnificent violinist and very modest, and you know, you are one of our great violinists. But they also point out that, like Nanette mentioned, that obviously your training as a violinist was interrupted, to put it mildly, during the Holocaust, crucial years in your development as a musician. So, you know, I don't know what to say. It was you would have been probably an even greater violinist had you not been in 3 different concentration camps. So,
yeah. Who knows what would have happened? It's true that I lost lots of a full year because of more than a year. And I was deported in the camps. But also another drawback was that when I was 13, I had tuberculosis of the lung, which was quite a serious illness in those days because they were pre-penicillin days. There were no antibiotics, so it was far more serious than later. So I lost quite a bit of time.
Were they, in your career as a musician in Holland, in Britain and so on, were there any particularly great conductors or other musicians you played with that you particularly admired?
Well, there were, in Holland I didn't play in an orchestra. It was, as I said,
the quartet.
Formed the string quartet. I made some recordings too of Haydn quartets. But in London and before, in the Philharmonia in the 1950s, I played with Klemperer a lot, Karajan, Giulini, all the great conductors of the time. And later on in the BBC, I played under a number of chief conductors, like Colin Davis, Pierre Boulez, Rozhdestvensky, fine Russian conductor, John Pritchard, and Andrew Davis. I said, and also for a very short time, Rudolf Kemper, who was a very fine conductor indeed. But there were lots of guest conductors I played with, and probably my favorite among them was Bernard Haitink, who is a very fine conductor and a very fine musician indeed. Among the older generation, of course, as I said, I played with Klemperer a lot, who was a great musician and great conductor. But my favorite among that generation was probably Bruno Walter, whom I was lucky enough to hear in the flesh. And of course I had a lot of CDs of and also Furtwängler, who was a very great musician, irresistible interpreter, really.
And I know we're almost out of time. I know that when you decided to retire, unlike some other musicians, you didn't want to kind of half play, because to play at your level would require you continuing to practice 7 days a week. So when you retired, you decided to retire, and I understand that. How have you occupied your time since retirement? You read, you watch films, or?
Well, I mostly listen to music. Music is my religion, really. I mean, it's for me, it's a spiritual experience, really, to listen to great music, to the music of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Schubert, and so on. It just it carries me into a. If I listen to them in a fine performance, I am in seventh heaven, really.
It's wonderful. So, Bela, I think we're probably out of time. It's good to hear you so sharp as ever, aged almost 93. As I said before, I very much hope this coronavirus pandemic will be over sooner than we think, and we can meet again soon. And in the meantime, I'll continue to send you some of my writings if that's interesting for you, and so on.
Yes, indeed, Tom. But before we finish, can I thank you, Tom, for your very interesting and informative dispatches on the Middle East. Obviously, I'm very interested in of what happens there, particularly in Israel, and your dispatches keep me up to date. I'm really grateful for you for putting me on the list.
Well, you're most welcome, and I'm really grateful for your friendship and for the time we spent today. So, Bela, we'll sign off now, but we will speak soon at any rate, and hopefully meet soon.
I hope so, Tom.
Okay. Have a good day.
And you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.